District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program. Welcome to District of Conservation. I'm your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. It's always a pleasure to bring on other commentators and journalists who focus on climate realism, energy reality, and the like. I'm really pleased to have Kevin Killough from JustTheNews here on the program this week. Kevin and I have talked a lot. He's cited me out for different newsmaking opportunities for his publication. So it's really good to have him join this side of the microphone or this side of the conversation to talk about his work and how important it is to have some realism injected into this coverage of energy, climate, conservation. Kevin, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Where did you develop a knack to, first off, do journalism? And then why do you have an interest in focusing on these energy and climate issues?
So it all began way back in 2013. I was a proposal writer and didn't like it, hated it. I'm just not really made for the hyper corporate world. So I was looking to get back into journalism, and I knew I'd have to start in small towns, kind of work my way up. That was going to be low salary and covering things like city council debate over trash rates, that kind of thing. Not exactly exciting, but nonetheless, I wanted to do what I love, so thought it'd be a good deal. And then I saw this opportunity in Tioga, North Dakota. This is right in the heart of the oil patch at a publication, a now defunct publication called the Tioga Tribune. And of course, it was going to be much better salary. This was at the height of the oil boom, so they were, the Great Recession had just skipped North Dakota entirely. They had more jobs than people, lots of stuff happening, crime, explosions. And so it was going to be a good salary, it was going to be a good opportunity, and far more exciting than a sleepy town. Well, of course, that was my first exposure to the energy industry. And during this time, I started engaging fractivists online. There weren't really any fractivists in North Dakota, but started engaging them online. And what I found was they were incredibly fanatical, horribly informed. And then this is right about the time Gasland came out, the Josh Fox documentary on gas drilling in Ohio, and it was just full of gross information and outright lies, really. And so this got me really interested because I've always been interested in broken information systems, where policies are being driven by factually incorrect information. And so it was many years before I found a good opportunity to become dedicated to energy reporting, because you look at these job ads and they'll be saying things like, we're seeing all this wind and solar development, become a part of this, covering this exciting transformation, and so finding the newsroom that was going to allow me to report things accurately was not easy to do. So, but then in 2022, Cowboy State Daily, it's a Wyoming publication, they were looking for an energy reporter. So I contacted the executive editor, Jimmy Orr, there, and kind of explained to him that, I think that there's an audience out there that's very hungry for a different perspective on the climate crisis, energy transition narrative. And they can't get it anywhere else. I mean, all the media outlets are lockstep in line with this perspective and will not present any countering perspectives. So, and he said, yeah, I think you're right. And so that started the conversation. I was the energy reporter there for a year. It was a fantastic experience. Cowboy State Daily is just dominating Wyoming media. And so, but everything had to be about Wyoming. It's a Wyoming publication, and energy is a much, much larger national global issue. So JustTheNews comes along, and they said they had lost their energy reporter, Addison Smith, to Newsmax. I think he went to Newsmax. And they, basically offered me the opportunity to do what I was doing, but for a national audience. And that's how I ended up at JustTheNews. And also, a couple months ago, I launched a Substack called The Wretched Hive of Scum and Energy, where I take energy reporting and show just across multiple outlets that just how bad it is. I mean, absolutely misinformed. And so, yeah, that's how I got into energy.
Everyone has their own journey into it. Mine is pretty interesting too, but I liked hearing about your trajectory, and the Cowboy State Daily is a great publication. They've done a lot actually recently to expose a lot of conflicting, problematic wind and solar projects, because even in red states, they're also being bogged down by these questionable projects too. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting you mention kind of this nexus of media and climate, because we're told, and I consider myself a freelance journalist when I'm not doing policy work. And I was told, through my journalistic ethics, teachings and different opportunities that I've done, early in my career, in my writing career, I remember if you're claiming to be impartial, you're abiding by the standard of impartiality, your publication shouldn't be, saying we agree with this notion of a transition, and then also admit that they're sponsored, because some of these publications, it could be a Politico or an E&E News or a Bloomberg or another one like that, where they claim they're impartial, they're objective, and then it says that the post is sponsored by such and such clean energy company, and then that they're also, agreeing with this transition narrative, which is debatable, because as we see globally, we still see huge demand for conventional energy like coal, oil, and natural gas. I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon, despite all the wish casting of a lot of these journalists. They seem to me more like activists. And this is not a criticism writ large of these individuals. There are some great reporters who work for mainstream outlets who don't fall into this category, but I feel like a lot of them are captured. It's really disappointing. I wish they had a more clear view about green energy and treated it with the same criticism that they do oil and gas. Is that your observation into kind of your colleagues in this space as well, that you wish that they would be more impartial and perhaps more objective in their reporting and not just agreeing with a message and then backpedaling when they become caught?
Well, first of all, you're right. Many of them are activists. And not only that, there's this large amount of funding going directly and indirectly into these media outlets. So take the Associated Press, for example. It seems like an objective organization. They received $8 million from groups like Quadrivarium and the Rockefellers in 2022. $8 million. They were going to hire 20 reporters dedicated to covering energy and climate with that funding. And anytime, and they're not unique. Many others, The Guardian, they've received funding. And then, of course, there's the indirect funding through groups like the Society for Environmental Journalism, Journalist, and Covering Climate Now. Let me get to those in a moment. Back to Associated Press, they receive all this funding, and what they do is when they announce it, which they do, they disclose it fully, but they say they present these organizations as philanthropy partners. So they make it seem like they're just interested in supporting journalism as an important institution in our democracy. And what they leave out is that these are political advocacy groups. The Rockefellers want to advance the energy transition. They want to promote the wind and solar industry. They want to demonize fossil fuels. And then same thing with Quadrivarium and some of the others that contributed to this $8 million. And then the Associated Press declares, but we're totally independent of our funders. That there's this hard editorial firewall, and they can't breach that. Well, I'm sure that the Associated Press is not inviting representatives from the Rockefellers to come to their news meetings and comment on developing stories or anything like that. I'm sure the bias existed prior to the Rockefellers deciding to give them money. But nonetheless, when 20 reporters at an organization that's struggling financially, that their jobs depend on that funding, obviously there's going to be some kind of bias. And all you have to do is look at the Associated Press's energy and climate reporting. You will not find, what you'll find is that the stories are consistently in line with a perspective their funders would like, that the energy transition is happening, that it's not facing major problems, that wind and solar don't have any major environmental impacts we need to worry about, and that climate change is posing such a great risk that it justifies any cost or harm that come from rapidly eliminating fossil fuels. I guess we're supposed to believe that it's just some spooky coincidence that bias exists, but I would say that funding definitely plays into it. And then there's these groups like Society for Environmental Journalists and Covering Climate Now. Covering Climate Now also it's funded by this kind of strange fund that's kind of secretive of where its money actually comes from. So it's not exactly sure, but they've received money from anti-fossil fuel groups too. And they partner with 600 plus media organizations that reach an audience of 2 billion. And you go to their website, coveringclimatenow.org, and you see all these articles that are consistently in line with this same message: climate crisis, energy transition, some of it just completely false, telling people that wind and solar are the cheapest form of energy. That's a big one. And that hurricanes are becoming more deadly and destructive than ever. Just absolute misinformation. And not only that, Covering Climate Now overtly tells reporters that this issue is so important, you should abandon all objectivity. You should present the climate story in every single story, no matter what it is, put it out front, and help advance this energy transition. And so with 600, when these media outlets, big names, partner with this organization, they're basically endorsing this message and saying we're on board with it. Even though Covering Climate Now doesn't police its membership or tell the outlets what they have to do, I did engage Mark Herzog. He's the executive editor there once. He told me their only rule is no climate denial. And so I asked him, well, what is climate denial exactly? And what do you do if somebody is engaging in this thing? He didn't answer that question. So, and then the Society for Environmental Journalists, they're the same way. They've taken all kinds of money from a lot of different climate activist groups, and they present the same message: abandon all objectivity and serve this narrative. And not only, and it didn't used to be that way. It should be noted, the SEJ, they used to actually invite organizations like the Western Energy Alliance to their annual conferences. About 10 years ago, they would do that. And, and now, or at least last year, they told that no industry groups were allowed at their conference, which is kind of strange. It's like, wouldn't you want to get that perspective? So there's a lot of this going on in a lot of different circles. And just to illustrate some of the hypocrisy of it, I did this story very recently. There's this narrative going around. Of course, one of the biggest, most formidable forces against the build out of wind and solar throughout our rural communities, red states, which is where you got to do it. You can't build wind and solar projects in the middle of LA. So, this is becoming a formidable force against that. And now there's this effort to kind of paint these grassroots community groups as being fronts for fossil fuel interest. And the way they do this is they find these very tentative connections. So ProPublica and Floodlight Media, as well as the Tao Center for Digital Journalism, got together to do this report on community opposition to solar projects in Knox County, Wyoming. Knox County, Ohio. And the way they connected this to the fossil fuel industry was just astounding. So there was like an individual in this group that was kind of organizing some of this opposition. He had worked at a company, Ariel, 20 years prior, and Ariel provides equipment to the oil and gas industry. Also involved in this was a former executive of Ariel. By the way, this is the largest employer in Knox County, so it's not surprising that a lot of people have connections to that company. But based on those connections, ProPublica and its partners conclude the entire thing is just a front for fossil fuel interests. And it's this long article they went into. But then I start looking at ProPublica and Floodlight Media and the Tao Center to see where they get their funding. And of course, it's the Rockefellers, it's the Sunset, forget what they're called, Sunset, but a lot of different climate activist groups are funding them. So I reach out and I say, hey, here you are taking these tentative connections to paint entire community opposition as being nothing more than a conspiracy of fossil fuel companies, which is strange because also two oil companies are one of the major investors in renewable energy. So it's surprising they're also conspiring to undermine their own investments. But anyway, of course, the article doesn't mention that. But I asked them, hey, you're saying these things about them at the same time taking direct funding from these political advocacy groups that obviously want to see this message. And of course, their response was, oh, well, we're totally independent of our funders. Yeah, we have these strict ethical standards, this and that. And so, the hypocrisy is that any connection, no matter how tentative to the oil and gas industry by any individuals within a community opposing wind and solar, is proof that the whole thing is a big oil conspiracy. But if they receive direct funding, and a lot of it, from multiple organizations who are advocating politically for an energy transition, for demonizing fossil fuels, and for propping up wind and solar as this glorious savior of mankind, they can just declare, well, we're independent of our funders. There is just a lot of this going on. And one of the other connections, besides covering climate now, Society for Environmental Journalists and direct funding, is more and more you're seeing partnerships. So Inside Climate News partnered, I believe it was CBS. They just did this whole series on plastics recycling and how advanced plastics recycling isn't working, and plastics are just terrible and they're polluting everything. And, so it's strange they would partner for this series with a political advocacy group, a group that specifically wants to, in the fossil fuel industry. So really our media are just absolutely polluted. And what you're seeing in climate and energy news is nothing that can be called objective and is basically paid advertising for the climate industrial complex.
It makes you think that they should reassess their career paths. I mean, they would make more money working for these climate organizations because they are blatantly engaging in activism. And do you think with all we've heard these predictions. I'm a little bit younger than you, but since I've been involved in this greater energy conservation movement, from the center-right perspective, I always remember these lofty predictions saying the environment is going to be destroyed by such and such deadline. The glaciers are going to melt fully in Montana at Glacier National Park. Then they took down those signs, famous signs that they had there. And Greta Thunberg said by June 2023, it's going to be, a 5-year end of the world, prediction. That prediction never came out. These same people, these so-called reporters, propagate the same thing, and they're never held to account. Do you think there's going to be a reckoning for them in terms of their credibility being called into question? I already see this kind of from both the policy side and the media side, that there's a lot more distrust, especially of so-called energy and environment reporters among the American populace, and media is not doing themselves any favors, generally speaking, but especially among the cohort covering the E&E beat. Their level of trust is really low, at historical lows, because people see that they're printing fear-mongering, that they're touting these so-called clean energies that are actually worse for the environment, that have a horrible footprint, that aren't recyclable, that still require fossil fuels to back them up and to power them, ironically enough. So is the distrust of this cohort going to increase? Are they going to perhaps reconsider their tactics and say, well, maybe we should cover things more truthfully and not in this very arbitrary or biased way?
That's an excellent question. I've been contemplating this, exactly how is this going to. So first of all, if you would have asked me this question a year ago, I would have said, yeah, we're going to have to wait until the national debt implodes our economy and we just can't afford green energy anymore before there's any changes. Then, of course, the election, big shift right, has really kind of highlighted that maybe people aren't going to go along with this as much as I thought they would. So that leaves the question, where are media outlets going to be? So, the Washington Post, it's quite the dumpster fire. It's losing huge subscribers, refused to endorse any presidential candidate, which was a good decision, but they also lost large numbers of subscribers because they wouldn't endorse Kamala Harris. So, there's a lot of different forces at play here. What are they going to do when, our subscribership is shrinking? If we keep, being overtly biased, and obviously so, it's going to further the distrust of us and what's going to happen then. But at the same time, the more they lose subscribers, the more revenue they lose from that stream. So the funders become more important. So it's kind of a question, there's this tug of war going on. Do we want to appeal to our funders and keep promoting this energy transition message at the expense of our audience? Then there's also the question, these funders are not, even though they're fanatically committed to their cause, they're not stupid. So, how long are they going to continue pouring money into media outlets that are obviously not winning the day, that losing subscriberships, when you're reaching a smaller and smaller audience for the dollars you're spending on it, what are you going to do then? So, yeah, it's going to be really interesting. We're kind of at this precipice with Trump coming into the White House again, and a national shift. What's going to happen? So, for one, Trump, if he's successful, will and almost certainly will improve the energy policy situation. We're going to see economic improvements, that weren't realized during the Biden administration. It's hard to say how much because, of course, we're producing so much oil and gas that prices are dropping. Basically, it's a wonderful story. We're actually meeting energy demand, but that demand's going to grow. So let's just say, Trump comes in. Doug Burgum is confirmed to the DOI, and Chris Wright is confirmed to the Department of Energy. They almost certainly will. I don't think they're going to face a lot of opposition. And then, of course, Weldon at the APA. We could see, great improvements, great positive developments economically and the cost of energy. So when that happens, it's going to be hard to maintain this is destroying everything because people aren't going to care. People aren't going to be listening to it. It's like, I just know my, energy costs are not going up and up and up like they were under the previous administration. So, we could see, this point where these journalists just can no longer just deny reality. They could come to that realization. And it's going to be really interesting to see what happens. Covering climate now is not going to change its mission. It's not going to say, okay, maybe we should be a little more objective and include industry voices in our reporting. That day is never going to come. Likewise, I don't see, reporters over there at the Associated Press, doing a friendly piece on Chris Wright, or even a balanced one where, they really present fairly what his, their ESG statement there at Liberty Oil, he's the CEO of Liberty Oil, their ESG statement called Bettering Human Lives is probably the most profound document arguing for the moral case for fossil fuels, saying, hey, let's look at what the impact of the absence of fossil fuels looks like. Yeah, we can look at the negative impacts, and those are real, but what does it look like when we take all that away? So, to see the Associated Press do a fair report on it, both the New York Times and the Washington Post have both done stories, hit pieces on Chris Wright, looking at that document and presenting it just with the most distorted, ridiculous view. So right now, there's no change, and I don't see it happening. But I don't know how long they can maintain that. You can only lose so much audience before your funders don't like funding a tree falling in the forest that no one hears. And at the same time, they're going to become more dependent on those funders. Are they going to be comfortable with that situation? Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out. A lot of different forces at work.
I've seen some of the hit pieces. I think Bloomberg did something, and I think Politico or someone else was echoing that he did this really terrible stunt to show that consuming fuel, is a boon to fossil fuel production, and that he's like this weird, bizarre figure. And anyone who isn't inculcated kind of by the cocoon that is in the Beltway. I've lived in the Beltway for almost 13 years, but I try to be as outsider as I can be because I travel the country, I talk to people, so I stay sane, relatively speaking, even living so close to this cocoon.
Yeah, that's impressive.
Yeah, it is a novel achievement. But you look at these people and they're not questioning, like Jennifer Granholm having his immediate predecessor, having questionable ties to different companies, conflicts of interest, no private sector experience in the energy production or consumption side. And to me, it just seems like that's such an unfair castigation of him. We will see that, of course, but I think Burgum and Zeldin, compared to, let's say, potential cabinet picks in other areas that Trump has selected, I think they're going to be easily cruised to confirmation. I don't see anything coming out of the woodwork that would derail their efforts. Like, they're very even keeled, and they're very largely in sync with, I think, where a lot of like center-right people and even the greater American public are. And I think the American public is coming around to not hating fossil fuels because they know that it also trickles downstream from the energy consumption production side to the consumption side. So many of the products we use are derivatives of oil and gas, petroleum byproducts. And they realize, if I stop the stream of flow and production here, it's going to affect the chain of everything else that we have, for products and transportation. So I think the American people are waking up and they like these people that Trump has nominated. But not only that, I think even Hollywood, I wanted to get your take on this, where I think one aspect of media, I think actually one particular Hollywood person, Taylor Sheridan, who's famous for the Yellowstone series, which is one of my favorite shows, and I'm not really into TV series, but he has a new show, Landman. And I think this is the one time I've seen Hollywood, like you said, with the Gasland documentary, really, throwing criticism towards fracking. You also had that movie with, I think it was Matt Damon, not Leonardo DiCaprio. Or you have The Day After Tomorrow. You have all these climate doom and gloom. There's the one about the BP oil spill, Deepwater Horizon. I think this is the first portrayal by Hollywood, at least remotely positive, of the oil and gas industry, the Landman series. Do you kind of see a little bit of a vibe shift happening, even with, the majority of E&E reporters and kind of the greater mass media culture favoring this kind of climate alarmist narrative? Although I think it is slowly being peeled back at, especially with the Landman show. But do you think there are going to be other gestures or perhaps awakenings or other vibe shifts in this kind of media ecosystem, even including Hollywood? I'm a little encouraged by this show.
Hollywood, despite, their obvious left bias across multiple projects, with respect to climate change, they haven't been just totally on board with it. To some extent, you had Don't Look Up, the Leonardo DiCaprio film. What was his Adam? I forget the guy who directed it, but you definitely had that in Hollywood, but it wasn't so front and center. So there's this group, Good Stories. They're funded by anti-fossil fuel groups as well, and they were consultants on scripts to try and insert the climate story into scripts, but that hasn't been happening just a whole lot. Twisters, there was a Twister movie that came out about. Yeah, they didn't mention climate change at all, and that was kind of a controversy, which is, funny. It's a controversy because there's absolutely no evidence climate change is doing anything to tornadoes. And but anyway, you have that, and then so it'll be interesting to see. But Hollywood is definitely one that's going to crack first, I think. Like with Landman, and then of course Yellowstone. It had some definite. They had that one scene, Kevin Costner questioning that guy about
his advisor about sage grouse. Yes.
Yeah, about sage grouse and the impact from solar development. So I think Hollywood's going to definitely. They're first of all just going to draw drop the message entirely and just avoid mentioning climate change at all. And then possibly we could see, some things like Landman, where there's an actual, hey, wind turbines require a lot of fossil fuels to produce, and then you don't get much energy for it. So entertainment is definitely going to be interesting to watch.
Kevin, if my listeners are curious to learn about your reporting work, read your latest updates, connect with you on social media, where would you like to send them to? Because I think you have an invaluable voice. You're really straight down the middle in terms of your coverage, and you have unique stories, investigative work as well. So please dispense all the links for everyone to connect with you and support your work.
I appreciate that. Yeah, on Twitter, I'm at Kevin D. Killough, Killough. You can follow me there. My Substack is The Wretched Hive of Scum and Energy, where I point out all the flaws in other energy reporters and what they're doing, and the at times absurd amounts of misinformation. And then Just the News, that is where I publish all my investigative pieces, and there's a whole section there on energy, and you can go and see my writing there.
Excellent. We will link to all those appropriate sources, social media, your work at Just the News, also your Substack. Kevin, thank you so much for joining the podcast as we round out the year. Everything is, I think it's going to be a positive 4 years. We're going to see the apoplectic reaction, of course, of the climate alarmists. Mm-hmm. I think we're going to see more energy realism, climate realism come back. And I forgot to mention, too, that a lot of people are afraid that there's going to be this despoiling of the environment by this incoming Trump administration. We had them before. There was no such thing recorded. I follow the lands issue side very closely. I'm a hunter and angler. I like to recreate on public lands. I'm probably one of the biggest defenders of public land, but I want them to be managed on the conservation side. But we saw with increased domestic production, this similar boosting of national parks, trails, roadways, and other infrastructure projects because of Trump signing into law the Great American Outdoors Act. And there's so many other examples. So I think a lot of fear is being placed on them from this kind of fear mongering that we see happening per usual from the media. But I think it's going to be a little less, because when people see the programs that were boosted, they see that we're not taking all these additional steps, to import energy that is riddled with perhaps the least environmentally friendly practices, sourced by questionable labor forces. It comes from countries that don't like us and don't respect the environment. And when people recognize that when we produce things here at home cheaply, safely, it's going to be a boost to the environment. And you don't Absolutely. Have to have this choice between prosperity and protection of the environment. You can have both. And I think the Trump administration, by all accounts and purposes, epitomized both. So that's something I think you're reporting. You have documented this whenever we have spoken about this topic. I think it's important to say that increased energy prosperity is going to lead to bolstering of the environment. It's just a natural consequence, because why can't we have both?
Right. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Of course, renewable energy, contrary to what the media tell you, is not environmentally friendly by any stretch of the imagination. So it has huge impacts. So we're going to see that dealt with a lot more rationally, especially with regards to offshore wind, and just a much more rational approach. And ultimately, there's no dirtier form of energy than no energy. So, richer country is a cleaner one. So things are going to get better.
It absolutely will. Kevin, thank you so much for joining the podcast. Let's revisit after the new year. Anytime you have a very riveting report or something that needs to get out there, our listeners love to consume these kinds of stories, these hidden or undervalued or underappreciated topics. And we like to break news here on the podcast of interesting stuff. So if you ever have anything investigative wise or something unique that needs to get out there, you have a platform to come on in the future.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We have a story on nuclear energy and women coming up with quotes from you. So that'll be on JustTheNews.com.
Excellent. Yes, I will be sure to share that separately of the podcast. And I appreciate you having me speak to you on that for my IWF work. And I hope you have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
And you as well.
If you enjoyed this installment of District of Conservation, I would love to know your feedback. Send it my way. Please be sure to leave us reviews on Apple, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are played. And also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat nor a guest announcement. Thanks so much for listening to District of Conservation. I hope you have a wonderful day and please share the podcast to those who may be interested in learning more about these critical natural resources, environment, energy issues.